It's time we head back into the wide world of IEMs, an ever-expanding universe of options that seems to double in size every month. KZ sent me the CCA CRA to review. This is yet another recent IEM release. This product cost a mere $15. Let's take a deep dive into the CRA and find out what it has to offer for such little price. CRA's box says that this is a, quote, heavy bass dynamic earphone. CCA claims that this new product allows you to hear details in the 7 kHz to 18 kHz range. They say that the CRA's upgraded dual magnet driver makes low frequency to be more prominent with better separation of vocals and music. CCA says that the CRA presents deep bass and ultra-high frequency details. They emphasize that the shocking low frequency will make you feel like at the concert, the vocal, the instrument, everything is heard clearly and thoroughly. These descriptions don't give us a clear idea of the sound signature. This IEM could be either V-shaped or W-shaped or something unique. You really can't expect much for $15. But you sure do get more than you might have expected with the CRA. The CRA is made of plastic. It's see-through. There's a silver finish wedge, and I cannot tell if that is actually metal. It feels like plastic. The entire housing is smooth to the touch. It is shaped like a cone, taking the shape of many IEMs in the market. The CRA is quite light. It weighs barely anything in the hand. The CRA comes with only the necessities. You get a couple of silicone ear tips and the 2-pin cable. The ear tips are good quality. The cable, surprisingly, is also rather good quality. It has a plastic sheath. The cable transmits very little microphonics, is pliable, and reasonably sturdy. You don't get a carrying bag, foam ear tips, or any other frills. As for comfort, the CRA is easy to wear. It sits securely within my ear cavities. The ear tips make a full seal, resulting in excellent passive noise isolation. Since the CRA weighs close to nothing, I never felt it popping out of my ears or needing readjustment throughout my listening sessions. I could wear this IEM for about 3 hours before needing a break. Overall, the CRA is surprisingly well built. It's light, easy to wear, and comfortable to me. The accessories are nothing to get excited over, but they are perfectly agreeable. In fact, the accessories here are far better than the trash blonde shifts with the BL03 and the BL05S, which cost more than double. I tested the CRA using several devices. This included my Army ADI2 DAC, the Eco Zerta ITM03, and the Lotu Paw S1. I used the stock accessories and listened to my test playlist on Amazon Music HD. And I also tried on Qobuz. The CRA is easy to drive. You do not need an amp. If you have a mobile device with a headphone jack, feel free to plug it in. The CRA is 34 ohms with a sensitivity of 105 decibels, and dongle DACs such as the ITM03 or the ITM01 or any other similar product will be plenty powerful for this IEM. CCA says that the CRA has prominent bass. My tests indicate that the bass is clearly elevated. In Mountains by Hans Zimmer, there is a sub-bass rumble from the start of the song. This is supposed to be quiet at first, then build into a crescendo. The CRA clearly presented that effect. It was louder than what I heard on the neutral Moondrop Quarks. Reverberation and transience was about average, as was separation of sub-bass from mid-bass. When the crescendo hit, the organ melded heavily with the other instruments. The rolling thunder effect was louder than all other elements. When the vocals chimed in, they arose from the background until they were about one step behind the instruments. In Conquered by Overwork, there's a rolling marble sound at the beginning. This is supposed to pan from right to left to center. The CRA rendered the sound of rolling marbles, but none of the panning. It sounded dead center. There are multiple drums in this track, and the CRA made them sound nearly identical. Each drum strike was hard and a little bit sharp. In comparison, the Quarks made the drum sound a little bit quieter. Each drum strike melded with the next on the CRA. I listened to several hip-hop songs including Pure Water, New Patek, Reel It In, and Uproar. On each occasion, the CRA presented the sub-bass without difficulty. It was emphasized and made the subwoofer sound like it was only a few feet away from my head. The drums were a little louder. Vocals were about one step ahead of the bass and remained clear. I listened to my Sicario playlist. I use these songs to determine if there's any audible bass distortion. Traversing from low to high volumes, the CRA never distorted. Overall, the CRA has elevated bass. Sub-bass gets a boost of several decibels. Mid-bass is also elevated. There's about average separation of sub-bass from mid-bass and no audible distortion. CCA doesn't say much about the mids response. My test suggests that the CRA has forward mids with sibilant vocals. In Orla Gartland's song Why Am I Like This, there is natural vocal grain and sibilance mixed into the track. The CRA accentuated both details. The Moondrop Quarks rendered these sounds closer to neutral. Orla's voice was easily one step ahead of the drums. There was some melding between the drums and the guitar, and the drums were always louder than the guitar, sometimes even drowning it out. In Watch It Back by Haim, the CRA again demonstrated that it does accentuate female vocal sibilance. The Quarks, in comparison, was noticeably closer to neutral. At 8 seconds into the track, the primary singer says the word "we" and drags it out, making it sound gravelly. The CRA clearly rendered this detail. There are 2 backup vocalists, one in either channel. Initially, the CRA presented this detail, keeping the 2 vocalists separate. When the instruments played at maximum, the voices of the backup vocalists melded into one. There was some melding between the drums, piano, guitar, and bass. The drums were louder than any other instrument. The vocals were about one step ahead of the drums. In Superposition by Young the Giant, the CRA presented the ukulele, drums, and bass clearly. However, the drums were louder than the ukulele. The primary male vocalist was clear and about one step ahead of the instruments. His vocal sibilance was marginally emphasized. On the Quarks, the sibilance was a few decibels less obvious. There's a backup vocalist in this track, and his voice is layered beneath the primaries. Most IEMs and headphones cannot reveal the subtle detail. The CRA did, but just barely. Between 1 minute and 10 and 1 minute and 20 seconds, there are sharp intakes of breaths. The CRA rendered this detail clearly. Overall, the CRA has forward mids. Vocals are sibilant, particularly female vocals. However, the drums never drowned out the voices. There is some bass bleed into the mids, but that does not seem to cause any muddiness. CCA suggests that the CRA has emphasized treble. My tests indicate that this IEM has an emphasized upper treble. In Scherzo for X-Wings, the CRA clearly rendered the brass and horns. These instruments remained separate from each other. Their nasally signatures were easy to hear. The higher pitch notes seemed a bit emphasized compared to the neutral Moondrop Quarks. The timpani was audible and a little emphasized. However, this never drowned out the other elements. The CRA appeared to have width but no depth or verticality. In other words, instruments seemed further out into the wings, but not layered as in an orchestra arrangement, and sounds never came from above or below. In Flight from the City, the CRA made the piano sound like it was about 5 feet away. Its bassy notes were emphasized compared to the Quarks. Transience was similar, however. I could easily hear the pops and sizzles and electric buzzing effects. The cello melded marginally with the piano, and the piano seemed slightly louder. I could hear the creaking of the wood on the pianist's bench and the shifting of the cello's weight. In Take 5 by the Dave Brubeck Quartet, the CRA rendered the piano in the right, drums in the left, saxophone center, and the bass a step behind. The cymbals, saxophone, and piano were all positioned separately. The cymbals remained in the left, the piano remained in the right, and the saxophone was dead center, with minimal melding among them. The saxophone's higher-pitched notes seemed a bit emphasized compared to the Quarks. The cymbal strikes were also louder on the CRA. The cymbals are struck at different positions, which should result in varying tonalities, and the CRA did present this detail. Overall, the CRA has slightly elevated treble, and I think it's likely in the upper treble area. There is good clarity and separation in this region. All instruments do not sound harsh or piercing, but they are a bit emphasized. CCA says that the CRA will render more details in the treble area. They don't go into details about, the details. From my experience with the CRA, I can confidently say that this IEM appears to have above average detail and clarity. Despite its bass emphasis, the CRA never presented a muddy, distorted, or veiled sound signature. I never felt as if instruments were completely missing, vocals were lost, or that subtle details were drowned out. Surprisingly, the CRA does render obvious and some subtle details. The creaking of wood, shifting of a cello's weight, multiple vocalists, sharp intakes of breaths, varying tonalities of cymbal strikes, twangs of guitar strings are all easily audible. Some subtle details like layered vocals are just barely noticeable. I have a quantitative test for detail retrieval. I use Kazuki's song New Light, which has layers of details. This includes the sound of wind, rustling of grass, children playing, synth, piano, and footsteps. I count the number of footsteps I can hear in the first 60 seconds. The audeze MS2 presents 8 to 9 footsteps. The Tin Hi-Fi T2 and the T2 Evo present 7 to 8. The Moondrop Aria presents 7 footsteps. The T2 Plus and the Blonde BL05S present 6 to 7. The The-Audio Legacy 2 provides 6 to 7. The Moondrop Starfield presents 6 footsteps. The Moondrop Quarks presents 5 to 6 footsteps. The Blonde BL03 and the Triple Wind Melee each present 5 to 6 footsteps. The CRA rendered 8 footsteps. For my detail resolution scale, I use the Moondrop Aria and Starfield as the average performers. Any IEM that provides more or less footsteps is judged accordingly. Thus, on my scale, the BL03 would be considered below average and the T2 would be above average. Using this standard, it seems clear to me that the CRA renders greater detail than the Aria, Starfield, Quarks, and the Blonde product. It tends to rival the detail I hear with the Tin T2 and the MS2. CCA does not say what we should expect in terms of Soundstage. Ear tips and your original recording will play a huge role in your perception of Soundstage. A song with not much bass might appear to have wider soundstage on an IEM that tends to overemphasize bass. It seems to me that the CRA has about average soundstage. It has some width but no verticality or depth. Instruments generally are close to the ears. Just as with the detail resolution test, I also have a scale for soundstage. For me, this involves, yet again, using the Moondrop Aria and Starfield as the average performers. Anything that has greater or lesser soundstage is judged accordingly. The Tin Hi-Fi T2 has above average soundstage. The audeze MS2 is similar to the T2 in this regard. The Blonde BL03 and the 05S are average at best, and perhaps slightly below average in soundstage depending on proper fit. The Starfield, Aria, and Quarks are average. I would place the CRA in the same category as the Aria and the Quarks. Remember, changing ear tips will affect this experience. CCA gives us a fairly vague idea of the sound signature for the CRA. That's fairly normal stuff for IEM companies. If you look at some of the frequency response graphs online, you'd get the impression that the CRA is U-shaped with recessed mids, but the experience is not what the measurements present. In my opinion, after listening to the CRA for a few months, I think it is a balanced sounding IEM. The bass is clearly elevated. Both sub-bass and mid-bass receive an emphasis. However, despite this, there is still about average clarity and separation in the bass region. There's some bass bleed into the mids, but nothing that results in muddiness. The mids are a bit forward, contrary to the graphs. Vocals stand one step ahead of instruments, and depending on the particular track, shoulder to shoulder with drums. Surprisingly, in my tests, the CRA never made vocals veiled or shrouded. They were never drowned out by the emphasized bass. However, there is an emphasis in sibilance and vocal grain. The treble has a marginal emphasis starting around the mid-treble region. However, this push was not harsh or piercing in my opinion. Brass and horn sounded clear with their higher pitched notes slightly louder, more obvious, than when compared to the Moondrop Quarks. The CRA has above average detail and average soundstage. I would say that the sound signature is closer to W-shaped rather than U-shaped. While the bass might be too aggressive for some, it might not be aggressive enough for others. It is, nevertheless, well above neutral. When CCA claimed that vocals will be heard clearly, I think they're basically correct. This IEM may not be your cup of tea. Those who simply cannot stand any amount of sibilance or do not want elevated bass will find this product less than desirable. It's important we compare products so that we understand where new gear fits in. Here, we will compare the CRA against the Tin Hi-Fi T2 and the KZ Zex. I use the stock accessories for all these products. I plug them into my passive AB switch and plug that switch into my RME80i2 DAC. I listen to my test playlist on Amazon Music HD and Qobuz. I try to volume match. The T2 has a considerable bass roll-off in comparison to the CRA and most other IEMs. That should not be a surprise. The T2 has greater separation of sub-bass from mid-bass, faster bass transients, and more bass clarity. The CRA has harder mid-bass impact. The mids are also different. Both IEMs push vocals ahead, but the T2 keeps vocals at least 2 steps ahead of instruments compared to the CRA's 1-step advancement. Both IEMs emphasize sibilance, but the T2 adds a few decibels more of it. The T2 has greater separation of mid-centric elements. The T2 has an emphasized treble, not too dissimilar for that of the CRA. However, the T2 seems to have a bit more upper treble push. Separation and clarity in the treble region is about the same between these IEMs. The T2 has about as much detail as the CRA, but overall a bit more clarity. The T2 has wider soundstage. The Zex has less sub-bass emphasis than the CRA. Transients is a little faster on the Zex. Separation of sub-bass from mid-bass is a little bit clearer on the Zex. Mid-bass impact is very similar, but I think the Zex might be slightly harder. The mids are a bit different. Both IEMs push vocals forward and both emphasize sibilance. However, the CRA tends to emphasize vocal grain a little bit more, obviously, than the Zex. The Zex places vocals closer to the ears. Separation of mid-centric elements is more obvious on the CRA, and it has more mid-region clarity than the Zex. Treble is very similar between these products. Both emphasize treble in the mid to upper treble region. Neither appears to be harsh or piercing even at high volumes. The Zex places instruments a little closer to the ears. The CRA has greater separation of treble instruments. The CRA has wider soundstage, more clarity, and greater detail retrieval than the Zex. In my new light test, the Zex rendered 5 to 6 footsteps compared to the CRA's 8. Comparisons like these help us understand where new products fit into the growing list of options. If you've never heard anything other than cheap earbuds or are an audiophile inexperienced with IEMs, then trying to decide which is right for you among the seemingly endless designs is a hard task. You don't need to spend a lot of money to get good sound. Products like the TIN T2, KZ Zex, and the CCA CRA show that you can find excellent products for affordable prices. All of these IEMs sound different from each other. The Zex and CRA sound similar but are not carbon copies of each other. Both have elevated bass, both have similar sibilance emphasis, both have treble push that appears to be a little bit similar, but the CRA is clearer with wider soundstage than the Zex. The T2 is a product unto itself. If you want analytical presentation of your music, then the T2 will likely deliver. You may end up hating any of these IEMs. Only you can decide if one is right for you. It's sometimes difficult to review IEMs. There's just so many options that it becomes a big chore trying to dig through one product after another. But the reverse side of that coin is that we do get lots of options, lots of potential IEMs that might be perfect for one person or another. It's also nice to see super affordable IEMs. With the likes of the Moondrop Quarks, we now have a taste of good products that cost around $10, yet provide great performance. The Quarks, as you might have guessed by now, is one of my benchmarks for neutral sound. And for $12, that's a killer deal. CCA has an alternative product in the CRA, a few dollars more and a few decibels greater in the frequency range than, say, the Quarks. This is my first CCA product, and I was quite surprised by the overall package. The CRA seems to be well built, it is comfortable, and it comes with good accessories. The CRA's sound signature seems to be W-shaped. Those who want bassy presentation and want to still hear vocals clearly, the CRA appears to deliver on both counts. Its average soundstage is nothing to scoff at. Its above-average detail is something to applaud. So, when it comes to my value judgment about the CRA, I give it a resounding yes. This IEM is clearly value. There is no doubt in my mind that for $15 you're getting good build, good accessories, and a sound signature that is somewhat unique, at least as far as the $15 market goes. While this IEM won't please everybody, it is not the throwaway product that we usually see in this price range. It's a true IEM worth considering, especially if you lean towards this type of sound signature.